Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, the forest becomes a silent battlefield of fear, endurance, and unbreakable love. Jack follows the police deep into the wilderness, chasing faint traces and fragile hope, knowing that somewhere out there, Tu Tien is struggling to survive, with their 3-month-old daughter, Anna, in her arms. As night falls, the search grows more desperate, and every minute feels heavier than the last. Meanwhile, far from Jack's reach, Tu Tien fights exhaustion, hunger, and cold, clinging to her last strength to protect her baby. Stay with us until the end to feel the tension, the fear, and the quiet courage that refuses to give up. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The forest was still soaked from the rain the night before, a thick, heavy mist clinging to the trees like a living veil. The air was cold and damp, pressing against Jack's lungs as he forced his way through tangled branches. His boots sank into the soft, muddy ground with every step, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. Somewhere in this vast, unforgiving forest were Tu Tien and their 3-month-old daughter, Anna. That thought alone was enough to make his chest ache. "Watch your footing," one of the police officers warned, sweeping his flashlight across the ground. "The soil's loose here." Jack nodded without answering. His eyes were glued to the forest floor, scanning for anything. Footprints, broken leaves, a sign that Tu Tien had passed through here carrying their baby. Every snapped twig sent a jolt of fear through him. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of running water. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. "She wouldn't go too far with the baby," Jack said suddenly, his voice hoarse. "Anna's only 3 months old. Tu Tien would stop as soon as she felt it wasn't safe." One of the officers glanced at him, his expression tightening. "That could be good news. It means she's careful, but it also means she might be exhausted." Jack clenched his fists. Exhausted didn't even begin to describe it. He knew how little Tu Tien had been sleeping lately, how she always insisted on doing everything herself, how she would rather push her own limits than ask for help. After nearly an hour of searching, the officer at the front stopped abruptly and raised his hand. "Everyone, stop!" Jack's heart slammed violently against his ribs. Ahead, hidden behind thick vines and wild shrubs, stood a small wooden hut. It was old, barely standing, its roof sagging dangerously, the walls darkened by moisture and age. It looked like a place no one had visited in years. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "A hut?" he whispered. They approached carefully. The door creaked loudly as one officer nudged it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The space was cramped, barely large enough for 2 people to lie down. In the corner lay a pile of ashes, long extinguished. Dry branches were scattered on the ground. "She stayed here," one officer said quietly. There was a fire. Jack stepped inside, his eyes darting around wildly. Then he saw it. Near the wall, half covered by dirt and dried leaves, lay a thin silver bracelet. Jack dropped to his knees. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The metal was scratched, the clasp slightly bent, as if it had been pulled off in a hurry. "It's hers," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Tu Tien's bracelet." The officers exchanged grim looks. "And these marks," another officer added, pointing to the ground. "See how the soil is pressed down here? Someone was sitting for a long time, likely holding a child." Jack closed his eyes. The image hit him with brutal clarity. Tu Tien sitting on the cold dirt, her back against the wall. Anna wrapped tightly against her chest, trying to keep her warm while fear gnawed at her heart. "She wouldn't stay if she thought Anna was in danger," Jack said, forcing the words out. "She must have left as soon as it was light enough to move." "That's likely," the officer replied, "which means she's still out there." Hope flickered weakly in Jack's chest, fragile but alive. Several kilometers away, Tu Tien pushed through dense undergrowth, her breath uneven and shallow. Anna was strapped tightly against her chest, using a torn piece of cloth she had turned into a makeshift sling. The baby's tiny body was warm, but far too still. "Mommy's here," Tu Tien whispered again and again, her voice trembling. "Just hold on a little longer, okay?" Her arms burned from the constant strain of supporting Anna's weight. Her legs felt like they might collapse at any moment. Every stumble sent panic shooting through her. If she fell, she could hurt her baby. She had left the hut at dawn, convinced she could find her way home by following the stream nearby. But the forest had betrayed her. The stream twisted and split, disappearing beneath rocks, leading her deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Her phone was gone. Her supplies were gone. All she had was Anna. Hunger clawed at her stomach. Her body felt weak, drained. Worse, her milk supply had begun to dry up from exhaustion and fear. Anna stirred, letting out a soft, fragile whimper. Tu Tien stopped abruptly, lowering herself carefully to the ground. She adjusted the cloth, pulling Anna closer, pressing her cheek against her baby's forehead. "I know you're hungry," she whispered through tears. "I know. Mommy's trying. Please, just stay strong with me." She rocked gently back and forth, humming a shaky melody Jack used to sing at night. The sound barely escaped her throat, but it was all she had left to offer. After a few minutes, she forced herself to stand again. "I can't stop," she murmured. "Not now. Not for you." Back in the forest, the search intensified. The police expanded their formation, scanning wider areas. Jack refused to leave their side, despite the fatigue creeping into his bones. "Sir, you need to conserve your energy," one officer warned. "This terrain is dangerous." Jack shook his head fiercely. "That's my daughter out there. I won't sit and wait." The words came out raw, stripped of pride and restraint. Saying them made the situation unbearably real. They followed faint clues: flattened grass, broken leaves, a scrap of cloth snagged on thorns. Each discovery was both a relief and a fresh stab of pain. "She's carrying a baby," one officer said. "That limits how far she can go." Jack swallowed hard. "She'll still try. She always does." He remembered Tu Tien's stubborn determination, how she would endure anything for the people she loved. That strength was the only thing keeping him upright now. But night was coming. Tu Tien stumbled into a small clearing just as the light began to fade. Her legs finally gave out. She fell to her knees, instinctively shielding Anna as she collapsed. "I'm sorry," she sobbed quietly. "I'm so sorry." Her vision blurred as she scanned the area desperately. Then she saw it. Another abandoned shelter. Barely more than a shack, but enough to block the wind. With the last of her strength, she dragged herself inside. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she gathered dry leaves and branches. Starting a fire felt impossible. Her fingers were numb, her mind foggy. But after several failed attempts, a small flame finally flickered to life. Warmth washed over her face. She sat down slowly, holding Anna close, checking her breathing, her tiny hands, her chest. "You're okay?" Tu Tien whispered, kissing her forehead over and over. "Mommy's here." Anna stirred weakly, letting out a soft cry. Tu Tien's heart shattered. Outside, the forest sank into darkness, shadows stretching between the trees like grasping hands. Inside the shelter, Tu Tien curled around her baby, using her own body as a shield against the cold. Fear pressed in from every direction, but beneath it burned a fierce, desperate resolve. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not with Anna depending on her. Night spread across the forest like a thick blanket, swallowing the last traces of daylight. The small fire Tu Tien had managed to keep alive flickered weakly, casting unstable shadows on the wooden walls of the abandoned shelter. Each gust of wind threatened to snuff it out completely. Tu Tien sat with her back against the wall. Anna pressed tightly against her chest. The baby's breathing was shallow, uneven, and every tiny movement made Tu Tien's heart pound harder. "Mommy's here. Mommy's here," she whispered over and over, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. What scared her most wasn't the pain in her own body. It was Anna. Anna whimpered softly, her tiny hands clutching Tu Tien's shirt as if instinctively begging for safety. "I know you're cold," Tu Tien whispered, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "I know you're hungry. I'm so sorry." She adjusted her clothes, pulling Anna closer, pressing her baby's small body against her own skin, hoping her warmth could replace everything she no longer had the strength to give. Outside, the forest was alive with unfamiliar sounds. Leaves rustled, branches cracked. Somewhere in the distance, something howled. A low, unsettling sound that made Tu Tien's blood run cold. She held her breath, listening. Nothing came closer. Still, fear wrapped itself tightly around her chest. Not far away, Jack moved through the darkness with the police, his flashlight cutting frantic lines through the trees. Sweat mixed with rainwater on his face, his breathing ragged, his legs burning with every step. They had followed the stream for hours. They had called out Tu Tien's name until their voices cracked, and still nothing. "Tu Tien!" Jack shouted again. "Anna, it's Daddy!" The forest answered with cruel silence. One of the officers checked his watch, his expression grim. "We'll keep going, but visibility is getting worse. We have to be careful." Jack nodded stiffly. Inside, panic clawed violently at his heart. "She has a baby," he kept thinking. "She's carrying a baby in this cold." Every worst-case scenario played relentlessly in his mind. He imagined Anna crying herself weak. He imagined Tu Tien collapsing from exhaustion. Each image felt like a blade slicing deeper into his chest. "This is my fault," he thought bitterly. "I should have gone with them. I should have protected them." The guilt was suffocating. Back in the shelter, Tu Tien felt her fire weakening. The flames shrank, growing smaller no matter how much she tried to feed them with the last bits of dry leaves she had gathered earlier. Her hands shook uncontrollably. "No. Please," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. She searched the shelter again, even though she already knew there was nothing left. Just broken wood, dust, silence. The fire dimmed further. Darkness pressed in from every side. Anna stirred again, her tiny cry weaker than before. That sound jolted Tu Tien awake from the haze of exhaustion threatening to pull her under. "No," she whispered fiercely, blinking hard to stay conscious. "I'm here. Mommy's not sleeping." She rocked Anna gently, humming through tears, her voice barely audible. The melody was uneven, broken, but it was familiar. It was the same lullaby she used to sing at home when Jack would smile quietly from the doorway. "Daddy is looking for us," Tu Tien whispered, clinging to the thought. "He won't stop. He promised." She didn't know if it was true, but she needed to believe it. Meanwhile, the search grew more difficult. The forest thickened. The path became unclear. The stream split into multiple directions, confusing even the officers. "We may have passed her trail without realizing it," one officer said cautiously. "She could have changed direction." Jack felt his chest tighten painfully. "She wouldn't go far," he insisted. "She'd look for shelter. She'd try to protect Anna." Another officer nodded. "That's what we're counting on." They marked areas they had already searched, slowly expanding outward, but every step felt heavier than the last. Night robbed them of speed. Cold drained their energy. Still, Jack refused to stop. "5 more minutes," he kept saying. "Just 5 more." But 5 minutes became 10, then 30, and still they found nothing. Tu Tien felt herself slipping. Her head leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing despite her efforts to stay awake. Every muscle screamed for rest. "Just a minute," her body begged. "Just a minute." "No," she whispered, forcing her eyes open again. "I can't." She shifted Anna slightly, checking her tiny chest, her breathing. Relief washed over her when she felt the faint rise and fall. "She's alive," Tu Tien whispered shakily. "She's still with me." But fear returned just as quickly. How long can I keep this up? She knew the night was far from over. Hours passed. The fire finally died completely, leaving the shelter swallowed by darkness. Cold crept in immediately, biting into Tu Tien's skin. She wrapped herself around Anna as tightly as she could, using her own body as a barrier against the cold air. Outside, the wind picked up. Tu Tien's teeth chattered violently. Her thoughts became sluggish, tangled. "If I don't move, she'll freeze," she realized dimly. With painful effort, she forced herself to stand. Her legs nearly gave out, but she leaned against the wall, steadying herself. "I have to keep moving," she whispered. "For you." She didn't dare step back into the forest, not in the dark. Instead, she paced slowly inside the shelter, rocking Anna, stamping her feet gently to keep circulation going. Every movement felt like torture. Fear surged violently through Tu Tien's body. "Anna," she whispered urgently, adjusting her baby, checking her face, her breathing. Relief flooded her when Anna stirred faintly. "Oh, thank God." Tu Tien sobbed softly. She pressed her forehead against her baby's, tears dripping onto Anna's tiny cheek. "Please," she whispered into the darkness, "Please let someone find us." Outside, the forest remained indifferent. Inside the shelter, a mother held onto her child with everything she had left, fighting exhaustion, cold, and despair. While somewhere beyond the trees, a father searched in the darkness, unaware of how close and yet how far he truly was. The night dragged on, heavy and merciless. And still, they had not found each other.